Dr. Taylor, we are ready to start. The floor is yours.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to this session. We're extremely happy that you're here, and we are extremely happy to have this panel discussion for you today. My name is Orlando Taylor. I'm a senior advisor to the president of Fielding Graduate University. I also have the honor of serving as the founding director of the Marie Fielder Center, which we will tell you more about in a moment. And I'm joined by a number of my favorite people from around the world. This is truly a global experience. We have people from Mexico, at least in Mexico, in the Netherlands, in the state of Washington, and in Washington, D.C. So how about that for something truly global, to celebrate something extremely important, the topic of social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion is a global issue. The significance of including people of different racial or ethnic or religious or cultural groups into the human fabric is something of significance to people around the world. And as long as we have divisions across people, we'll always have conflicts around the world. So welcome today. We are extremely, extremely happy. If we go to the first slide, please. Today, we're going to be, in this particular session, we're going to be speaking about the Marie Fielder Center for Democracy, Leadership, and Education. The center is, if we go to the first slide, you will note there is, we state that it's a multidisciplinary and inter-school. We say inter-school, it means across the different schools of fielding, the school of psychology, for example, interconnecting with the other school of leadership studies. It's a multidisciplinary and an inter-school space for fielding faculty, students, and alumni to engage in research, public discourse, and advocacy to advance social justice, leadership, and education. We believe that to advance these important topics, it's important for people to work across segments, across disciplines, across ages, across genders, and so on. So the Marie Fielder Center is designed for just that purpose. We encourage research and special programs that will address national as well as international educational and social issues. And it promotes Marie Fielder's principles of transformational change to change societies for social justice as exemplified through Dr. Fielder's work, her philosophy, and contributions to equity and justice. Next slide, please. Just a word about Marie Fielder. The next slide, please. And the Marie Fielder Center. We established the center in January of 2016 to honor the legacy of Dr. Marie Fielder, a member of what we call the founding family of Fielding Graduate University in the 1970s. And we emphasize the construct of founding family and her role in that, because if we think about it, sadly, most universities, at least in the United States and many parts of the Western world that I know about, celebrate men, white men, in founding institutions of higher learning. It is very rare to find the name of a woman, or the name of a woman of color, to be recognized as a founder of a university. There are some exceptions, particularly for women's colleges and some of the historically Black colleges, but for the most part, women and persons of color have been on the outside in terms of at least recognition. It does not mean they did not have a role to play, but in terms of the recognition in the founding of a university. Marie Fielder played such a role. And I've spoken with her daughter, Dr. Nicola Smith, who's a member of our faculty, who tells me about the fact that the founders of Fielding Graduate University met in their home as they conceived the notion of Fielding Graduate University. So it's significant that we recognize this giant of a woman who was a part of what we say now, the founding family of Fielding, who later served as a member of the Board of Trustees, I believe the chair of the Board of Trustees, I believe the initial Board of Trustees of Fielding. So that's the history and the background of Marie Fielder. You'll hear more about her momentarily from my distinguished colleague, Dr. Johnson. Next slide, please. The Marie Fielder Center awards a medal each year. We call it the Marie Fielder Medal for Social Transformation. It recognizes individuals for a lifetime of achievements that support the advancement of social justice in either in a local arena, a national arena, or an international arena. And on your screens, you'll see the names of some of the people who've been awarded the Marie Fielder Medal. We do it annually. I won't read all the names, I'll just highlight a few. You'll see the name of Patricia Gurin, for example, Professor Emerita at the University of Michigan, who did the foundational psychological research, social psychological research that established the premises of the significance, rather, of affirmative action in higher education, noting that affirmative action, or should I say now into modern language, diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just advantages, not just provides important contributions to those who've been oppressed and marginalized, but it provides input and important contributions to the dominant group, the majority group. They benefit as well. In fact, Patricia Gurin's landmark work showed that white students benefited more from inclusion, diversity, and equity than students of color because they were having exposure to different ideas and different people and different perspectives. And in the process, it expanded their notions of themselves and the notions of humanity and the notions of the nation. Dolores Huerta, the co-founder of the National Farm Workers Association, along with Cesar Chavez, who many of you know that recognize Cesar Chavez's name, often may not recognize Dolores Huerta's name, co-founder of the National Farm Workers Association. You know about the grape strike, the Delano grape strike in the late 1960s. She's still an activist in her 90s, I might add. She was awarded the Marie Fielder Medal for Social Transformation just 2 years ago. Next slide, please. We also have, as a part of the center, something called the Marie Fielder Fellows. These are doctoral students and alumni from across all schools and divisions of Fielding. These fellows seek to advance social justice and inclusion that's complementary to their doctoral work. It's not a replication of their doctoral work, but it's in addition to, it's in complementarity, if you will, to the work that they're doing for their doctoral degrees. It also includes fellows alumni, who might have started their work as a fellow and completed after their graduation. And you'll hear from one of them momentarily. Fellows seek to advance interdisciplinarity and networking across academic boundaries. We provide funding for them to advance social justice projects through their own work. We currently have 14 fellows, and I'm very, very pleased to announce that we'll be inducting 15 more fellows in June of this year, in just a few weeks. And some of you may be on board and wonder when that's going to happen. Very soon, in a matter of a couple of weeks or so. So we'll have at that point 30 fellows from all across the university, current students, former students, alumni, and so on, who are working on specific projects. We provide them with mentorship on getting external grants to support their work. We connect them to national and international academic bodies to advance their work as well. And then finally, before I introduce Dr. Johnson, I want to tell you a bit about how we fund the center. If you go to the next slide, please. Very few university funds are deployed to support the work of the Marie Fielder Center. That's very important to point that out. It partially shares from indirect costs from grants we might receive from the United States government and foundations, but especially the Marie Fielder Center thrives because of gifts. I want to emphasize that, and you will note that I put it in all caps. The center depends upon gifts, financial gifts, by the way, financial gifts. I should have that word there. From you, alumni, from friends, and so on. And you've been very generous over the years. in supporting the work of the center. And if you have any questions about how to make a gift, you can certainly reach out to our colleague, Elena Nicholson, also to me directly, and we can guide you to the appropriate individual and the appropriate website. But that gives you a framework of the work of the Marie Fielder Center, the life of Marie Fielder. And now we want to move over to give you more background on Marie Fielder. And at this point, I'm going to introduce you to Jenny Johnson-Reilly. Jenny Johnson-Reilly is a former, I shouldn't say a former, she is a fellow of the Marie Fielder Center. And I'm going to have her introduce herself and tell you a bit about herself, but most importantly, to tell you something about Marie Fielder. Dr. Johnson, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. I have good morning written down on my notes, but as Dr. Taylor pointed out, it's morning where I am here in Seattle, and greetings to you everywhere, all over the world, in whatever time zone that you may be in. So as Dr. Taylor said, I was, and I continue to be, a Marie Fielder Fellow. I completed my PhD at Fielding in 2020, and my work focused on sort of an intersectional analysis of the movement to end violence against women. And since that time, I've been working on a monograph about Dr. Fielder. As Dr. Taylor pointed out, she was foundational in the formation of the university, but there's not a lot written about her. And that's been the project that I've been engaged in over the last few years. So I'm going to share my my slides here and talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments of Dr. Fielder, and in particular, her work in social justice, although I will say that all of her work was focused on social justice. So there's an extent to which it was difficult for me to pick what bits to share. Okay. So this is the photo of Dr. Fielder that we have featured on the website for the Fielder Center. And as I mentioned, my talk today is going to be a little bit about some of her accomplishments. So Dr. Fielder was born in Texas in 1917, and she would often say, "I am the granddaughter of a slave who was sold for learning to read while holding the family Bible for the master. So I come from a family of troublemakers." And Dr. Fielder was an extremely intelligent child. She scored so highly on a school-administered IQ test that the state of California sent a worker to her home to ensure that her family environment was suitable for a child of her intellectual potential. And I start with that information because it's noteworthy, given that she went on later to kind of challenge prevailing notions and theories of intelligence. So here's a little bit about her education. She had a bachelor's degree from University of Southern California, as well as a master's, and then earned her PhD from the University of Chicago in 1959. So Dr. Fielder was one of the first researchers to critique the socioeconomic bias inherent in standardized IQ tests. And you can see there on the right a newspaper clipping about some of her early work. She went on in 1960 to organize a statewide conference in California on the topic of creating intelligence. And at the time, the prevailing theory of intelligence was that it was innate. It was fixed, you were born with it. And she argued instead that intelligence was conceivably a range, that where a person actualized on that range would depend on their circumstances and the resources that were provided with. But even then, she thought that the range might not be indicative of an individual's potential, depending on the particular activity or the particular level of support that they had in their lives. One of the people who I've been fortunate enough to spend time with during my research is Dr. Fielder's daughter, Nicholas Smith. And Nicholas shared with me that this conference that Dr. Fielder organized was sort of indicative of her style of work. She often acted on ideas regardless of whether they seemed feasible at the time, and they were often wildly successful beyond what anyone expected. So while Fielder was planning this creative intelligence conference, she decided to contact Ivan Dixon, who was the star of the popular TV show Hogan's Heroes, because he'd been active in civil rights causes. She didn't know Dixon. She didn't really have any particular avenues to connect with him, but she just decided that would be a good idea, and it worked. He showed up at the conference. Nicola recalled that similar conferences at the time could expect around 50 people, but 500 people attended the Creating Intelligence Conference, which charged twice the going rate for attendance. And the venue sold out, so Fielder added a second day to allow more people to participate in the conference. Dr. Fielder often facilitated interracial community dialogues. And some examples of this is she facilitated such a dialogue after the Birmingham church bombing in 1963 and after the King assassination in 1968. And her goal was to de-escalate violence and promote community healing. She also implemented this first two-way busing system in Berkeley, California, in the Berkeley Unified School District. I think my slides might be out of order here. I apologize for that. So here's the slide on the integration efforts. So in 1968, she was instrumental in organizing crosstown busing that was bi-directional. So prior to that work, students from the African-American side of town would be bused into the white side of town, predominantly white side, in order to integrate schools. And Dr. Fielder argued that that was inequitable, which it clearly is. And so she instituted two-way busing. So students from all over the city were being bused in different directions to kind of integrate students and integrate them within different communities. And so you might recall, if you followed the presidential or vice presidential debates, that Vice President Kamala Harris would credit this program with enhancing the quality of her elementary education. And Fielder continued to consult with school districts across the nation on matters related to integration and improvement of racial relations throughout her 60-year career. Dr. Fielder's career, I think, was remarkable given the range of her racial equity work. During the 1970s, she was involved with the Black Panther Party. And throughout the 80s and 90s, she also worked as a consultant on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion for corporations, including Merrill Lynch and Rockwell International and the Intuit Corporation. And she was also hired to assist Berkeley, Los Angeles, and New York police departments to improve race relations. And she also assisted NASA's Office of Equal Opportunity Programs to develop its affirmative action program. In 1974, Fielder joined with Halleck Hoffman and Frederick Hudson to found Fielding Graduate University. She helped draft the Articles of Incorporation, which were signed on her birthday, as Dr. Taylor mentioned, at the home she shared with her daughter. So Fielder was a member of the first board of trustees, and she later helped to develop the doctoral program in Educational Leadership for Change, where she worked as a faculty member until her death in 2002. And her daughter, Nicholas Smith, continues to serve as a Fielding faculty member in that program. So those are a few of the highlights from the monograph research that I've been completing. And I will turn it back over to you, Dr. Taylor.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that background. You can see while we've talked about Marie Fielder as a part of the founding family, signed the board of the Papers of Incorporation for the university. Very significant. We don't want to lose that in history. We really want to preserve that. And that's why we're taking the time today to give you that background. But as I said at the very beginning, the issues of equity, inclusion, and so on, access, is a global issue. And we are honored today to have two very distinguished individuals I would also call my friends, who've agreed to serve on this panel. And I don't want to do the normal thing of just reading some bio on them. I want them to tell you a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves, to tell you about their own work, where they are in the Netherlands and in Mexico and in the United States to advance social justice. And then I'm going to ask them a few questions to really get this conversation going. We don't want this to be a moment to talk at you. We would like it to be interactive. And so while we'll have some opening remarks from our colleague Mary Tupanueno and Patricia Arredondo, we will eventually open up the conversation for all of you on the Zoom call right now. And if you're quiet, I have many questions myself, so don't worry about us not having enough questions to stimulate conversation. But first, I'll ask my longtime colleague, Patricia Arredondo, on whichever planet she's on to introduce herself and to make some opening remarks. And then Mary Tupanueno, I'll ask you to do the same after that. Patricia, please.
Okay, Dr. Taylor, buenos días. Buenos días a todas y todos. Ironically, Dr. Taylor, I am in Phoenix, returning to Mexico City on Wednesday. And so I'm delighted that I could be here on West Coast time with you. So just to say that I am delighted to be invited to serve on the panel. Just in terms of a little bit about my relationship with the Marie Fielder Center, I'm on the board of directors of the Marie Fielder Center for Social Justice. I'm also a faculty fellow with Fielding, and I've had the opportunity to present at the residencies over the last 5 or 6 years. The years keep going, Orlando. So, you know, what year is it now? So we're at 2022. So it's been a while that I've had this engagement. Real beneficial with me. To say that a little bit of context, this wonderful library behind me is in the state of Puebla, Mexico, and I think Dr. Taylor's been there.
I have.
'16th, 17th century books and other artifacts that go back now 3 or 4 centuries. And if someone wants to use them, of course, you have to be careful, you know, if they'll allow you to research with them at that library. But I couldn't help but take this wonderful photograph because the library, of course, is so significant to our work in terms of knowledge building and again, the whole cultural context in Mexico of what literature means and how literature has been used. And you can't see behind me, but maybe I'll move my head. Let's see if I move my head. There's an altar back there, and you can see an image of the Virgin Mary. The library was started and funded by a Jesuit priest from Spain, and a lot of those individuals, the priests, came from money, and they were able to establish institutions of learning as well as, again, the library. My work in social justice is extensive. It's kind of longstanding, and both, you know, in the United States and in other countries in terms of my consultation and my coaching with other people who are interested in the work I do. I look at equity issues, particularly for underserved populations. Historically, those have been immigrants and immigrant families in the United States, Latinx individuals, again, many immigrants as well in the Latinx population, and of course, women. I'm very committed to equity issues for women and have been able to work with Dr. Taylor on all the endeavors he has led to facilitate women's opportunities in higher education, academic leadership for women in higher education. And his work, our work together, really inspired my latest book on women in STEM professions, thriving in the chilly climate. And it is about women in STEM and how they continue to advance in spite of all of the conditions that are not necessarily encouraging of them or empowering of them. So this is research, and then the book came out with the research embedded in it. But learning just so much about the, also in the book, just to say one more thing about it, there are so many women, as we know, in STEM who come from racial, ethnic backgrounds. And so this was US based, and did a lot of digging around to identify these women who have made huge contributions, but were often overlooked because they were women, of course,
Mhm.
or left off a Nobel Prize or left off some other major publication because they were women. But again, my work is about giving voice. And one more thing, currently I am leading my own consulting company, the Arredondo Advisory Group. And I'm just delighted to say that all the organizations I work with are really now endeavoring to address equity. It's not, they're not, fortunately, they're not saying to me, we want diversity training, because I wouldn't do it anyway. It's really about change. Everything is about change and starting with the leaders of an organization. So it's very energizing, just like this conference is this morning. Gracias
Thank you.
for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And by the way, as questions come up in your mind, I hope that you will just put them in the chat. We don't see all of you. We know there are hundreds of you around the world, of course. We don't know that. But you have questions, you have comments, or you have reactions you may have at the moment. So put them in the chat now so you don't forget them. And then we'll be able to shortly to give them to our panelists so that they might respond. And Dr. Arredondo, I'm going to ask you just one small bit in a moment, not now, but to ask you about issues around social justice and inclusion in Mexico, because most of us, though it's our border neighbor, know very little. We don't know much about people of color, for example, in Mexico. We don't know about exclusion in Mexico particularly, so we'd be very interested to hear about that. But before that, I would like to ask my colleague, Mary Tupan-Bueno, who I have known also for more than a few years in the Netherlands. And it's amazing how we can be brought together electronically, by the way, that we couldn't do 20 years ago, 10 years ago, when we first started working together. But now it's just like you're just right next door to be able to join us and don't have to get on a plane to fly all the way to California or Washington or wherever to meet. So good afternoon, Mary. Welcome. Introduce yourself, please, and give your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Orlando, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody around the globe. It is definitely a pleasure to be in a panel with all the distinguished panel members, but especially with you, Orlando. I mean, you know, COVID prevented us to meet and see each other, but this is a great way to be in touch. And maybe for the audience, Orlando and I have been working together in different ways. I mean, the work that I do is focusing on students with a migrant background in the Netherlands, and we met through the work that we do in equity and access on a European level, on a Dutch level, and also in the US, Orlando. And you know, I have learned a lot from Orlando and from many other American colleagues. And I think maybe to give you a sense of the Dutch context, I mean, if you look at the Netherlands is very multicultural. We are one of the smallest nations in the globe, and one of the smallest nations also in Europe. But we have always been seen as being very progressive and very tolerant. And I think that this is an idea that we, you know, like to indulge ourselves with. And, but, you know, everywhere in the world, there has been a lot of migration from the north to the south, from, you know, the west to the east, from the east to the west, and also in the Netherlands. And I think that for especially in the past so many years, with also a large influx of refugees, the Netherlands have become a very multicultural society and very diverse also along other dimensions of diversity. And I like the title of this conference. It's about co-creation, it's about leadership, and that's part of the work that I've been doing in the past years and am still doing. And to give you a sense of, last week I was at the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona, and we talked there about the right to higher education. And if you would look at the Dutch system and the Dutch context, every student basically has the right to higher education and is supported by the government to exercise the right. It is quite affordable. In the Netherlands, if you have a diploma of secondary education, you basically can go to any university in the Netherlands. Universities are not allowed to not admit you. And this is something that we will probably have an admission system in a few years, but it is a fairly open access system. But despite that all, we still have a lot of underrepresented students, or inequity in higher education, inequity in the transition to the labor market. And there are large gaps among students of color, students with a migration background, in terms of retention, attainment, and also getting internships at the labor market, going to the labor market. And so, to me, that's always the Netherlands in itself. I mean, we also have a lot of great things in our system, but it is interesting that a system that is fairly open, is very affordable, still has the same kind of challenges compared to other countries. So there's something within institutions, or with the translation of macro policy on a macro level, that is being translated to a meso level and to the individual level, where things are going wrong. So one of the, and I'm not going to share a lot, I just wanted to give you two examples of what ECHO does in terms of making sure that we make visible what the human potential is among the community of the community of color. And in 2001, we started an initiative called the ECHO Award. And for the ECHO Award, we basically, and it's still going strong, it is a funded program by public and private entities. And but basically in 2001, we sent a letter to all presidents of all universities in the Netherlands. There are not so many as in your country, but definitely, about 50 to 60 universities. And we asked them all to nominate their top 3 students with a migrant background. And well, if you would translate it to the language in the US, it would be, you can say this is affirmative action. And we were intentional in asking universities this. And it was interesting to see that students were nominated by their institutions. And this is in 2001. The language about equity and access, and especially about the multicultural society, was a different one, was a more difficult one. I mean, we didn't see every migrant student as potential for society. And so, going forward now, after more than 21 years, what we see is that and maybe to give you a little bit of context, the students that were nominated were all students that were high achievers academically, and also students who are active in their community, in society, within their university. So these were all students that were very active agents in society. And so although affirmative action is not really embraced in the Dutch context, these students were, I mean, people were in fact not surprised, that would be not nice to say, but I mean, doing such a thing was kind of unorthodox, but it created a lot of visibility for students who have always been themselves, but we're now seen as potential. And we often get the criticism that that people say, oh yeah, but that's easy because these are the high achievers among the migration, the students with a migration background. And then we always say, yes, that's true, but nobody noticed them as being a high achiever. And apart from that, they are paving ways for many young people in secondary and primary education. So, you know, after 21 years, I mean, among the students who are still very much connected with ECHO, we have a few professors. We have a few people who are captains of industry and who are still very much linked with the work that we do. Well, I just wanted to mention to you that from a leadership, I mean, this is something that Orlando is talking, is very focused on as well, is, you know, what do we need to do to develop a potential of leadership from the communities that are not often seen as one. And, you know, I didn't expect it many years ago that this community would, you know, become a real community and also still being still connected with us. And so I'm grateful for that. But yeah, let me, I had another example, Orlando, but let me stop here because given the time. And
okay.
Yes.
I'll get back to you and you can give that example. And I
Good.
must say that I've had the privilege of knowing some of the students, and including one who was a student who now has a PhD and a professor, just to name one. So it's really heartwarming to hear about the significant work and the outcomes of that work over the years. Just before we move on and to open up for dialogue, I want dialogue among ourselves, by the way, to stimulate that thing. And I'm going to just ask you, Patricia, so many of us in the northern part of this hemisphere don't know much about issues of diversity, equity, inclusion in Mexico, where you spend at least half of your life. Could you tell us a bit about students of color, in quotes? That term is not a Mexican term, but I'm thinking of particularly students of African descent in Mexico and how they fare. Could you make any comment about that? Most people are surprised they didn't know about that. We've talked about it before, that most people in the United States have no idea that there's a Black population in Mexico. Could you talk about that a bit?
Thanks, Orlando. Let me start by sharing more context, and then I'll go there. I mean, understandably, Mexico is a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. The conquest happened 500 years ago, and that's right now quite a bit featured in the museums around the country. And I spend a lot of my time in Mexico City, so I'm there and see the acknowledgement of the conquest. And there's still a lot of mixed feelings about that, as you can imagine. With the diversity within the country is enormous. The southern part of the country, the states of Chiapas, Veracruz, and Guerrero, is where you will see a very dominant presence of people of different indigenous tribes. They're around the country totally, but there will be more of a evidence in the southern part of the country. And there's a lot of history around that. The other part of the history, of course, is the indigenous groups. There are hundreds of indigenous groups, groups that still speak their primary language, and Spanish for them is a second language. So that continues. In Mexico City, a lot of the vendors in the city who are, have kiosks, selling food, selling textiles and other artisanry, you will hear them speaking their primary language to one another. But if I want to buy something, they'll speak to me in Spanish. So this is very fluid. It's a country with a lot of fluidity in terms of language, in terms of mestizaje, mestizo. Everyone is, pretty much mestizo, which is a combination of ethnicity and race and culture. So it's hard to say anyone is pure this or that, unless, of course, if there's anyone who could claim that they're not of mixed heritage, it would be people who still live in the indigenous communities, who have not migrated from those communities. And there are people, communities like that in the southern states. So Guerrero is the part where you will see the more dominant African featured individuals, I guess, visible African individuals in the state of Guerrero, which is where Acapulco is. Everybody knows perhaps where Acapulco is, which is down south. The second president of Mexico was Vicente Guerrero, who was of African heritage. And again, ironically, the state is named, Guerrero, but there are people of Black descendancy in Mexico. And that's nothing new, but again, is there a stratification? Of course there is. In Mexico, there's stratification based on color, or there is a phenomenon of colorism. Someone who's brown like me versus someone who's more white in appearance versus someone who is more African in appearance. So all of that is a dynamic, whether it's in schools, in employment, who's in the government. And I mean, the government actually is more multicultural in appearance, visible appearance, than it is in the United States. And that's, again, part of the history of Mexico, is that there have always been the mixed mestizos, the mestizos, which is the mixed culture, mixed race, mostly mixed race as they call it. And that is also at play with the border issues, and I'll talk about that for a moment. We know that historically, people from Mexico and Central America, but let's say primarily Mexico, have been the migrants to work in the United States throughout the country. They're known for their agricultural labor, but they've also worked in other labor areas around the country, meat packing, textiles, and so forth.
Dolores Huerta and her work with the farm workers speaks to that.
Oh, the farm workers in the United States, Dolores Huerta, as you mentioned earlier, Dolores Huerta is the co-founder of the migrant farm workers movement in the United States that started in Delano, California. I had to remember that. Dolores is now 92, I believe, Orlando.
Still a baby.
Maybe.
Still a baby.
Yes. And right now, I think the equity issue she's leading is on behalf of education. And she works with immigrant families around the country, trying to empower them around their rights in schools. Amazing. So we have the historic workforce that was brought to the United States and came to the United States to work in labor, cheap labor. Okay. Now, many of these individuals are undocumented still in the United States after being here 20 years. So then we have that phenomena of Daca for the undocumented student who is born in Mexico, or the children, intergenerational families that are mixed legal status. But the other phenomena I wanted to mention, besides the one that we always hear about, which is at the Arizona, Texas, California border, is the border with Central America. So Mexico has also a border issue on the south with the Central American refugees who want to get to the United States, and they do their journey walking. Most of them walk from Central Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador to try to cross the border. Right now, Mexico has other refugee issues. There are a lot, this is ironic, right, or not? People who are leaving Cuba in the last 2 months. There are about 50,000 refugees who've left Cuba. They get to the United States. They get to Mexico to try to cross into the United States. Okay, so that's one phenomena. We have the Haitian refugees who also go to Mexico to try to get to the US. And then now we have the Russian and Ukraine refugees who are also in Mexico and attempting to get to the US. So it's a country that's become now sort of a passageway. And did the African diaspora arrive in Mexico primarily through slavery? Part of it did. Part of this came on the early boats to Veracruz. That's why you have also a visible representation of people of African heritage in Veracruz, because that's where the landing occurred, in Veracruz, and of the boats and all that. But the diaspora also came from the United States. People who were slaves in the United States also migrated to Mexico. I mean, then the borders were more fluid. I read a couple months ago a book where they were actually going to try to start a unified slavery movement between the U.S. and Mexico back in the what was this, early part of the 20th century. Because there was, I'll share this with Dr. Taylor later, but there was a big movement in Maryland to try to advance this whole diaspora, or again, the hold on slavery. This would have been, the time of the Civil War. Actually, it was the time of the Civil War. So they were trying to, get Mexico into that as well. So the diaspora continues. I think people still look at Mexico as a place where there's opportunity in terms of, being a little bit more economically, I guess, sure to live. But the cultural dynamics and the gender dynamics, I'll just say one more thing about gender now. And Jenny mentioned it before. One of the big social justice issues is violence against women, and that violence is happening. It's been happening for years, but there has not been a concerted effort to address the violence. Only women are doing the voices. I mean, you would think the legislators would be doing it, but I haven't seen enough action on their part to address the feminicide and other forms of violence against women. And those are, continuing stressors in the country. And, because I'm not a Mexican citizen, I really am also measuring how much I say in a critical sense. But when it comes to violence against any group, I give voice to that in my work there, here, and so forth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mary, there's a question in the chat that I wish you would comment on if you could right away. It's a matter about how words matter. Someone wrote, "I truly appreciate how you describe students as students with migrant background instead of migrant students." Did you comment on your selection of terminology for that?
Yes. Yeah, and you're right, and also for the person, thank you for mentioning this. It does matter. I mean, language matters. Vocabulary matters, and I think what we often why I choose this is everybody has different backgrounds, and for students, it is. One is their migrant background, it's their ethnic background, it's their racial background or their racial identity, and they are more than just migrant students. And I think there's a big discussion in the Netherlands also about intersectionality. And I think what for us and my organization, what matters is not just only how we describe our students, but I think it's more important is that we acknowledge who they are, and they can be who they want to be, given all the different dimensions of their identity. And this is definitely something that, especially our work is not just, we don't do research, but we are involved in policy making and also in the translation to practice. And I think acknowledging people for who they are and using the right, connotations and that's hugely important. Yeah.
Jenny, you live in the upper Northwest on the West Coast of the United States, and we read more in the media. I hear more in the media about border issues, issues in the southern part of the United States. We don't hear as much about issues in the upper Northwest in the United States. Can you give us, from your vantage point, some of the main social justice issues that you see in a place like the state of Washington, not the city of Washington, the state of Washington? Could you comment on that?
Sure. Well, I think, I hear a couple different threads in there, sort of the border issue as well as social justice issues. And obviously those intersect, but are different as well. I think, to be honest, I don't hear a lot about border and immigration issues from the northern border with Canada very much either. And I think with respect to immigration, my area of Washington, Western Washington, the Seattle area has large immigrant populations from across the globe. So definitely, Ukrainian, Russian immigration all throughout Africa as well. A lot of immigrant communities as well. And I think that how those issues intersect with social justice issue, all kinds of different social justice issues, certainly with the issue of sexual violence, which is one of the areas that I'm interested in. And Patricia, you talked about that. Domestic and sexual violence is certainly a global epidemic. The World Health Organization talks about how 1 in 3 women will be a victim of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or sexual violence during their lifetime. And so I think that sometimes in terms of access to care, access to trauma-informed services, certainly immigration status, but also cultural status, cultural communities and finding practitioners who are culturally competent can be a barrier to access to services as well. I think here in the Seattle area, and I will say also in Oregon as well, our neighbors to the south are dealing with a lot of socioeconomic stratification. So especially during the pandemic, we've seen an explosion of homeless populations. And a lot of those folks, I think, are, dealing with some of the issues that are traditionally associated with homelessness, chronic mental health issues that have been left untreated, drug and alcohol issues. But I also think we're seeing a lot of economic pressure that's pushing people out of finding any kind of affordable housing. So those are some of the issues that I think that we're seeing here in the Northwest.
Thank you. It's really great to have a panel of people who come from different parts of the world to talk about a common topic. And so I'm going to step back a little bit now and ask you, Patricia, or you, Mary, or you, Jenny, if you have a question you want to ask of each other. And we're getting more and more items coming up in the web and on the chat room, and I'll try to organize them and I'll throw them out in a moment. But what about you among yourselves? Patricia, you have a question or comment?
My comment is the commonality, and I just wanted to agree with what Mary said about how we identify the students. And I think it's important to not step into labeling, because when you put the modifier in front of their other identity, then that's what pigeonholes them. You say, I worked a lot with students of immigrant backgrounds and refugee over the years. So to say that they're immigrant students, right away, there's a connotation. And, they can't speak English, or, all of the other negatives. So I think our language is important. I also, Mary brought up the intersectionality and how we today, consider all the identities of the individuals and or groups we work with, so that it adds more complexity. But for myself in doing this work, I have to always remember I'm in a place of quotes, educating others or coaching others who are not as immersed in this work, and not to be impatient with that, because there's a lot of default into labeling based on people's unconscious biases about migrants or immigrants or women or people who are in the, really been affected by COVID, as Jenny said, and, a lot of blame. And I think we have to be able to get into more empathy because these are very complex situations. And I think social justice work requires empathy. And it's that kind of open-mindedness. So I just wanted to acknowledge some of what my colleagues have said here, Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, and it is what is. I mean, labeling is one part of it, but I think what we always, I think what's important is that that we keep the conversations going, and you're right, you need empathy. But I think now, especially, I also wanted to mention Black Lives Matter, Orlando, because, it's interesting to see how Black Lives Matter and the worldwide global movements, what it did, for instance, in a country like the Netherlands. I mean, before that, yes, we spoke about discrimination. Yes, we spoke about racism, but less about racism compared to sexism. And now there is, it definitely created a sense of awareness among, among politicians, among university leaders, in corporations, and among, everybody else. And also the idea that racism is something that is also happening in the context of the Netherlands. I mean, that's really something that I embrace, in going forward in this work. And it's also, I'm happy to say that, for instance, now we have a national coordinator responsible to deal with racism and discrimination. The Ministry of Education, they have a program director. There are a lot of conversations, and I don't say that that these are easy conversations, not at all. But I think to have the conversations is one way to create understanding and to at least hear each other out. And because that's a big struggle, especially for countries who have never seen themselves as also being, oppressive and being intolerant. So yeah, that's I guess, and I'm wondering how for instance, Black Lives Matter, how that also impacted conversations in, for instance, Mexico and also in the US and Canada.
I think it's interesting that you all really contextualize your remarks to show that we are really an interconnected world in many ways, because some of the same issues, perhaps in different shapes and forms, but underlying the same issues. One of the persons in the chat, by the way, put in a notation about 60 minutes. One of our Marie Fielder fellows, I might add, Dr. Sabrina Epps, noted that 60 Minutes did a piece recently about how immigrants are treated differently depending upon where they come from. And she pointed out, for example, refugees from Haitians, for example, in Mexico, being treated and thought of as being different from those migrants from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
The United States is a country of immigrants. By the way, being an immigrant in the United States, unless you're a Native American, is everybody, in either forced immigration or voluntary immigration. But depending upon where you're immigrating from, seems to make a significant difference. And apparently, that's an issue in Mexico, and probably in the Netherlands as well. I'm thinking about immigrants from Romania, for example, versus those from say, Indonesia. for example?
Oh yeah, but definitely, but we saw. I mean, it was there's a lot of conversation also in the news about how, for instance, how we treat refugees, for instance, from Syria, from Africa, from Latin America, compared to, for instance, refugees now, for instance, from parts of Europe. And you know, it's I mean, of course, a country should welcome every refugee despite where you come from, but apparently there are differences. And I think it's good to have this honest conversation about how we you know, how we behave towards different groups in society. Yeah.
Well, I would agree. The situation with the Syrians and how they were not welcomed as they're welcoming the Eastern Europeans currently. But also it's the colorism issue. Why the Haitians or the folks who are leaving Cuba are visibly African in appearance. So that's another border issue there with the Cubans as well as the Haitians. Central Americans, everyone knows what their migration pattern is, and it doesn't mean there's less prejudice towards Central Americans because they're not seen as Mexican, but there's still that colorism that plays into a lot of this reception or lack of reception of refugees and immigrants.
There's been a lot of talk in our panel today about issues around commonality. I wonder if the panelists might wade into the water of allyship. Could you give examples of where allies have worked together across groups to address common issues, and maybe an example or two where allyship didn't work, where people could not work, even amongst those who are oppressed, could not work together? So could anybody make any comments about allyship? Because obviously separate leads to unequalness in most cases, whereas working together might help lift the boat for everybody. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to respond on that, Orlando. And you know, allyship is extremely important in terms of, you know, strategies for organizational change, strategies for improving context. But we have recently been working, and it's a type of allyship, and it's a type of co-creation. We worked with the government to promote students being seen as co-creators and allies, but also as partners in institutions to collaborate with institutions to improve equity and inclusion practices. And so this was, not to keep take a lot of time, is that so the government agreed to fund institutions for programs where they collaborate with students. They had to pay students from the funding that they received. But we also asked the government to provide funding for student organizations, to make sure that you know, they're not seen only as an ally and as, you know, students who are keen to support and to help programs, but that there's also an actual sharing of power. So students received funding as well to do similar things from the government. And, you know, we've been working with institutions and with student organizations for 5 years. And very interesting things came out of that, because what we saw is that students have the vision, have the experience, and know a lot of what's going on among students' communities, which is often much more difficult for institutions, although they would like to. But, you know, they are, in fact, psychological distances from their world and the world of students and what's happening within communities. So I wanted just to mention seeing students as allies, but not just to do voluntary work, but also, you know, see them really as allies too, in terms of sharing power and sharing the work.
You know, allyship is a term that's used a lot in higher education, in the social sciences, but it's not used a lot in the workplace. And that is a concept, the concept of allyship we have brought into our consulting work. I'll just put it that way. When we are involved with leaders, we want to engage them with the understanding of what allyship means for leaders, how allyship can really be an opportunity to, how do I want to say, reduce oppression in the workplace, where allyship can mean standing up for someone who doesn't have the voice and the power to stand up for himself or herself. And I'm pleased with how leaders in the workplace have been really kind of gravitating to this term, because they see it as a way of describing how they can intervene, how they can support, and how they can be better listeners, more inclusive. We call it inclusive leadership. So being an inclusive leader means learning how to be an ally as well, and practicing allyship. So that's one area that we've worked in. What I also see, to build on Mary's comment, is the relationship with communities, and how, whether it's a university or a non-university work setting, where engagement with the community means an opportunity also to engage with allyship. And thanks to George Floyd, again, we have to go back to the reality of what happened in 2020, that cities across the country, other workplaces, have really become more committed to engaging with their communities, broadly speaking, because they're very much different types of communities around the city. And that has also allowed us to talk with these organizations, these cities, about allyship and what it means to be an ally with a different community in your city. So it's really an ongoing process of, we're all educating ourselves as we go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think, a lot of my work is historical, both with my work with the monograph with Dr. Fielder's life, as well as my research on the movement to end violence against women. And there's a social justice element to that work, in that we're recovering lost histories, or histories that haven't been told before, such as in the life of Dr. Fielder. But I also think there's a really practical application to that research, in that a lot of this ground, in terms of allyship and various movements, social movements working together to try to address intersecting issues, and I think that institutional power kind of wants those of us working in DEI work to forget about that work that's already been done. Because if we forget about it, then we have to kind of reinvent the wheel and try to address these issues as though we're addressing them for the first time, when that's not the case at all. And so, like, when I think about Dr. Fielder's life, I think, yes, this is great we can recognize and acknowledge her work. And also, I think, especially when we look at her work on intergroup dialogue and the expansiveness of her work in terms of working with the Black Panther Party on the one hand, and working with law enforcement to try to address race issues on the other, we really see kind of a guide for trying to bring people together in a way that, if we polarize them, we polarize ourselves, and we polarize those that have different perspectives than we do. It's difficult to really have sustainable change, because people are fighting, whether it's people on opposite ends of the spectrum, or even those that are allies, are working together with different perspectives on how a movement or how change should move forward. I think it's so important to kind of look to those lessons of history.
Let's see, do we have other questions? Let's see.
It looks like there's a couple new ones in the chat.
Somebody's written his note here. I'm interested to Dr. Tupanueno I'm interested in how your equity and advocacy work plays into the issue of skilled migrants in the Netherlands.
Yes, and maybe so what do you exactly mean with skilled migrants? You mean so can you elaborate, the person who asked the question, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? Maybe let me say this is our work goes further than just focusing on higher education. It also in fact focuses very more and more on the transition to the labor market, and also a lot of issues that are linked to the labor market. And so, yes, I mean, there are what we see right now is a big issue in the Netherlands is how difficult it is for students who are almost graduating or have been graduating to get a position at the labor market. So we have different programs where we work with companies and with students who are almost graduated to make sure that they are supported and guided, get opportunities in different companies, but besides that, we have a large network of eco ambassadors, and these are not just students or PhD candidates, but in fact many professionals. And what we try to do is in our work, in our advocacy work, is but also in our consultancy work, to work with young people and professionals from our communities to to increase the number of encounters that companies, because right now you can say that yes, the Netherlands is very diverse, but if you look at the highest positions at different organizations, whether public or private, it is not that diverse. I mean, and not that diverse in terms of gender, not that diverse in terms of ethnicity, color, migration background, and also different gender identities. So I think that that's something that is very important, that and that's something that we actively do in any way we can. We also collaborate with the Ministry of Employment, and in fact the Ministry of Employment is developing a lot of policy to make sure to bridge the gap between different communities who have less access to labor market positions. And in that conversation, we always include different members of our communities to show that not all people with a migrant background are not skilled, but there are so many examples of very skilled and very knowledgeable persons. And so those are the kind of things that we definitely do, and it's never enough, I can tell you that.
I'm wondering, as we move towards the end of our time together, if you could give some comments, any one of you, about our next steps. It seems like, in a certain sense, we've been at this for a long time, but trying to build an inclusive world. And we have three steps, 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, or the other way around, 1 step forward, 2 steps backward. And some people would argue that the reason that happens is because we've not found a common hook for diverse people to buy into the notion of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. In your mind, what is there a common hook that everybody can buy into, that can agree on, that is into everybody's interest to be on board to advance the issues we're talking about today? If you could pick one, what would it be? A hook.
Well, for me, Orlando, I think one of the hooks is definitely leadership. And because you need leadership on different levels. And I don't just think people on higher levels within society and organizations, but you need leadership on different levels. I mean, people who show agency, who are willing to step beyond the borders, who push borders. So, one of the partners that we collaborate with for the ECHO Award said, we need movers and shakers. And I think that's that proactive attitude to push boundaries is definitely important. And I think another part that I would say from the work that I do is too often we think, and my background is in policy, but too often we think that everything that has been developed on a macro level is automatically translated in the right way to the institutional level and to the individual level. But that's not true. So, apart from a lot of the policy that we develop with all the good intentions, we need to combine that with a vision on implementation to make sure that impact is more guaranteed than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
Wanted to thank you. I really appreciate what Mary said. I was just to add, I think the word contextualize is what comes to me. We have to contextualize our work. And there was something that was put in the chat box about making sure we're not trying to be missionaries when we work with communities. I believe that is also shifting. And I work with different organizations. We know that you have to co-create, you have to come together in order to bring about change. And that is the only way change will occur and sustain, because everyone has to own the change. So I would agree with Mary and say, contextualize your leadership, because there are leaders at a number of levels in the organization, any organization, but we could probably not move forward with the work we do if we did not have committed leaders who are looking for outcomes. You can't just say this is a nice thing to do. What are the deliverables? So that's the other side of it, is leadership for pragmatic outcomes. That you leave a legacy behind of the work you do. It's not about you, it's about the legacy for others who will follow you.
Yes. Well, one for me is that I always try to ask the question, I try to deal with the issue of what's in it for me as a perspective. I have many of my male colleagues and some women colleagues. Why are you so active in gender issues and women's issues? So this is for women. No, it's not for women. It's for us. Mm-hmm. And I think if you just think about this on a global level or a community level, there are benefits for inclusion for everybody. Everybody wins to have an educated workforce. It's for the economic development of the country. If the country economic development is positive, I benefit to it because I have a better life myself. Yeah. So I think we have to find ways to communicate and to educate the public about the benefits of inclusion, equity, access, diversity, and so on, and benefits for everybody. There are some people who feel, for example, that you talk about Black Lives Matter. Well, don't white lives matter? Yeah, they do. But the understanding, if you have in one segment of society that's marginalized or oppressed or victimized, ultimately it has an impact on me. And so that's a way of communicating about this. I think is important for us as leaders to find language that articulates to everyone that all of society benefits from inclusion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have only a few minutes left. I'm going to give about 2 minutes each one of you for a closing remark, and then we'll say thank you. I think we've covered most of our comments and questions in the chat. We can provide ways of communicating with our panelists perhaps later to the audience. I have no idea who's out there, but this is a special moment, I think, to bring together people with so many interesting backgrounds from many diverse backgrounds to talk about a global issue. So just a couple of minutes for each one of you to close out. Jenny, you started this, so I'll start with you. Then we'll go around with Patricia, then Mary, and then I'll say goodbye to everybody. Jenny, any closing remarks on Marie Fielder?
Yeah,
What she would think about this panel today?
I think she would love it. I think she would love it. And I've loved it. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel. As you were asking me to think, or asking us to consider some closing thoughts, I've got, 6 or 7 other thoughts that I'm still developing as we've had this conversation. So thank you to everyone and those in the audience with their questions. I think that the takeaway from Dr. Fielder that's most applicable to our conversation this morning is just the piece about intergroup dialogue, the piece about communicating, of trying to reach and connect with others in order to promote change. And also, I think a little bit about her style of leadership as well, which was when you get an idea about how to move something forward, even if you're getting a lot of feedback that it's not feasible, try to go for it anyway, because some really, really amazing things can happen as a result.
Thank you. Mary?
Oh, yes, well.
I'll give you the last word. I'll give Patricia the last word.
Thank you so much, Orlando, for inviting me, and also Fielding University for inviting me. Well, I think I appreciated all the different perspectives from the different parts of the world. And, although we have been doing this work for quite a while, it is interesting to see that every so many years contexts change. The issues are not changing and the challenges are not changing, but the context is changing. And with that change, we need to regroup and reconsider whether what we are doing is still if that's still the right thing to do, and if we're still reaching the people we intended to reach with our work. And I think that is something that keeps me sharp and keeps me going. And I wanted to thank all the other panel members, Patricia and Jenny as well. And hope to see you sometime soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary. Hope to see you in the Netherlands sooner than later.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Patricia?
I too want to thank Jenny and Mary, and of course, Orlando, for bringing us together. I remember when I was a lot younger, I think I was graduating from college, and there were a lot of things occurring. This was right around Kent State, the incident at Kent State in 1970. And I was wondering to myself, does anything I do make a difference? And I think that question has stayed with me for many years. And I think the answer is anything you do can make a difference, as long as it's around improving a life situation for others, for yourself, that there will always be oppression in this world. And that, as Mary said, we have to adapt it, but some of adapt ourselves to the context. But there will always be issues of marginalization and issues of underrepresentation. So our work doesn't end. We may have different strategies to do the work. And so whatever work we do, though, I do believe makes a difference. And I always will step into a gap, as I call it, a gap where someone isn't getting heard, where someone's not getting the services they need, and see what I can do, because it's a little step. But I think all of us have that power to step in and bring about change at a local level. It doesn't have to be macro. Those local level changes do matter. They empower others. So I just want to keep that in mind as we continue to do our work. Everything matters.
Thank you. As we close, I want to again remind all of you that the Marie Fielder Center is a center that does not receive a large portion of the fielding budget. We do it through donations. We do it through indirect costs we get from grants and so on. But we do provide financial support for our students and our alumni who are engaged in the work that we've described. Not scholarship work, but financial support to support their projects. Sometimes it involves travel to professional meetings to give a paper. Sometimes it means travel to a particular location to collect data for a research project. Sometimes it means attending a conference where they might acquire information that would facilitate their work, but it all requires funding. And so therefore, in closing, I'm going to ask each one of you to consider making a donation to the Marie Fielder Center for Social Transformation. And we'd be very eager, for education, leadership, and research. We want to ask you to consider making a donation to the center, and you can reach out to me directly if you would like, or to Elena Nicholson, our Director of Development. Again, I want to thank our panelists today. It's been a real joy to both see you and with you, and to hear your perspectives on this important topic. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for sticking with us for an hour and a half. Seems like a very short time, but it's been an hour and a half. For sticking with us to engage with us in this important conversation. So with that, thank you, and stay tuned for the next part of the conference.